Walt Disney built the most visited entertainment empire in the history of the world. He also had a house. This is the story of the house, and everything the house reveals that the empire was designed to hide. The house sat on 5 acres in Holmby Hills, Los Angeles, at an address called 355 North Carolwood Drive. It had a rose garden, a private gate, a small red barn in the backyard modeled on a farm in Missouri, and a tunnel running under the garden that Walt built because Lillian refused to let his railroad disturb her roses. Walt called it the happiest home on earth. He lived there for nearly 20 years. He died across the street from his studio in December of 1966, and Lillian lived in that house alone for 31 more years after him. When she died, the family sold it. The buyer demolished it. A 35,000 square foot replacement mansion went up on the same 5 acres. The gate was kept, the tunnel was kept, the house was gone. That estate is where the story begins and ends. But to understand what it means, you have to start somewhere else entirely. You have to start with what Walt built, what it cost, and who paid. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you are watching from. If you are new here, consider subscribing. We tell these kinds of stories every week. Walter Elias Disney was born on December 5, 1901 in Chicago, Illinois. He was the 4th of 5 children born to Elias Disney and Flora Disney. His father was Irish-Canadian, a man of restless and frequently failing temperament who moved the family repeatedly across the American Midwest, trying carpentry, contracting, farming, and various other ventures, most of which collapsed. By the time Walt was old enough to understand what failure looked like, he had seen it many times on his father's face. Elias Disney is a complicated figure in the historical record, and biographers have argued about him for decades. Some portray him as straightforwardly abusive. Others argue that those portrayals impose modern sensibilities on early 20th century Midwestern family life. What is documented, without serious dispute, is this. Elias used a switch, a thin green branch cut from a tree, to punish his sons for transgressions both real and imagined. He moved the family from city to farm to city again, as his ventures failed in sequence. He extracted years of unpaid labor from Roy and Walt on a newspaper delivery route in Kansas City, pulling them from bed at 3:30 in the morning every day, regardless of season, to deliver 3,000 papers before school. Other boys working on the same route were paid $3 a week. Roy and Walt received nothing. When Walt found ways to earn small amounts of money privately, taking a side paper route or working briefly at a candy counter near school, he kept those earnings hidden from his father, because Elias would take them if he found out. 2 of Walt's older brothers, Herbert and Raymond, eventually left home, rather than continue living under those conditions, fleeing in the night without telling anyone. Walt, under the sustained pressure of those years, became a bedwetter. And yet Walt spoke of his father for the rest of his life. He did not speak of him only with bitterness. In interviews, in private conversations, in the things he told his daughter Diane, a complicated portrait emerged. A man who was tough, who believed he was raising his sons correctly, who had genuine convictions about hard work and honest living, and who was also causing damage he either could not see or chose not to examine. Walt told Diane that he thought Elias was tough, but that he loved that old man. Disney animator Ward Kimball, one of Walt's closest friends for decades, observed that Walt never fully recovered from his father's strictness, and that it shaped his relationships with other people throughout his career in ways that were not always productive. Both things were true simultaneously. Walt loved his father, and his father had hurt him, and he carried both of those facts for the rest of his life, without ever fully resolving the tension between them. The Marceline years, 1906 to 1910, were the exception to everything else. Walt described them consistently, across decades of interviews, as the best period of his life. The farm sat near the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe railway line, and Walt spent hours listening for trains on the track. His uncle Mike Martin was a Santa Fe engineer who worked the route between Fort Madison, Iowa, and Marceline, and Walt absorbed everything about trains from him. The way they moved, the sounds they made, the geography they connected. He sold his first drawing, a sketch of the neighbor doctor's horse, for a small payment that represented his first understanding that he could exchange what he imagined for something real. He sat under a large cottonwood tree on the property that he called the Dreaming Tree and invented stories about animals that could talk and walk and feel things the way people felt things. That tree was later registered as a historic landmark. Decades later, when Walt built Disneyland, he modeled Main Street, USA directly on the main street of Marceline's downtown. In 1938, at the height of his fame, he wrote for the Marceline local paper that more things of importance happened to him in that town than have happened since or are likely to in the future. He was one of the most recognized people on earth when he wrote that sentence. The family moved to Kansas City in 1911. Walt was 9 years old. What followed were the years the Dreaming Tree could not protect him from. The newspaper route, the 3:30 wake-ups, the cold winter lobbies of apartment buildings where Walt would slip inside to warm himself between deliveries, and where he occasionally fell asleep standing up against a wall because he was too exhausted to stay on his feet. The wages that went to his father, the private earnings he hid, the older brothers gone. Roy, 8 years Walt's senior, was the one constant. He occasionally used his own small savings to make sure Walt and their younger sister Ruth had toys, small gestures of care inside a household where care was distributed unevenly at best. Walt later said that many of the habits and compulsions of his adult life traced directly back to those years. The need to control, the difficulty trusting, the conviction that no institution, no employer, no partner would protect you if protecting you became inconvenient. He had watched his father give everything to various enterprises and receive nothing reliable in return. He had delivered 3,000 newspapers before dawn for years and taken home $0. The lesson was not complex. He would own what he made or he would lose it. Eventually, he did what his brothers had done before him. He lied about his age, told the Red Cross he was 17 when he was 16, and signed up to drive ambulances in France at the end of the First World War. The war ended before he reached any real action. He came back to America with an ambulance covered in his own drawings, a habit of smoking that would eventually kill him, and a set of convictions about independence and ownership that would shape every decision he made for the rest of his life. He came back from France having seen no real combat, spent time in Kansas City drawing advertising cartoons and taking art classes, and in 1922 did what seemed at the time like a logical next step. He opened his own studio, Laugh-O-Gram Studios, Kansas City, 1922. Walt had assembled a small team of animators and signed a contract with a Tennessee company called Pictorial Clubs, Inc. for $11,000 to produce 6 animated fairy tale shorts. Pictorial Clubs went bankrupt before making a single payment. The contract was worth nothing. Laugh-O-Gram failed. Walt sold his film camera to raise enough money for a one-way train ticket to California. He arrived in Hollywood with a reported $40 in his pocket, an unfinished short film under his arm, and the specific kind of determination that comes from having already failed and survived it. His older brother Roy was already in Los Angeles, recovering from tuberculosis at the Sawtell Veterans Home. Roy was genuinely ill, genuinely confined, and genuinely not planning to start an animation studio from a hospital bed. Walt came to visit and explained what he had in mind. He had secured a letter of interest from a New York distributor named Margaret Winkler for his half-finished film, Alice's Wonderland, which placed a live-action girl inside an animated cartoon world. He needed a partner. He needed someone who could handle the business while he handled the creative work. He needed Roy. Roy got out of bed the next morning. He never had a tuberculosis relapse again. They founded Disney Brothers Cartoon Studio on October 16, 1923, working from a small rented space in their Uncle Robert's garage. The Alice comedies, produced under the deal with Winkler Pictures, ran to 57 shorts over several years. The formula worked. A real girl interacting with animated characters, a concept Walt had inverted from Max Fleischer's Out of the Inkwell series, which placed animated characters in the real world. The series was successful enough that both brothers could afford to get married. Roy married Edna Francis in April of 1925. Walt married an ink artist at the studio named Lillian Bounds in July of the same year. As the business grew, Roy proposed a name change. Not Disney Brothers Studio, Walt Disney Studio. He removed his own name from the door. Walt accepted. This moment, Roy quietly erasing himself from the credit for something he had co-created, would prove to be the template for everything that followed between them. By 1927, Winkler Pictures had been taken over by Margaret Winkler's husband, Charles Mintz, and the Alice series had run its course. Mintz arranged a new deal with Universal Pictures and asked Walt and his chief animator, Works, to design a fully animated character. The character they created was Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, and he was an immediate success with audiences and critics. Walt felt confident enough after Oswald's first season to travel to New York in February of 1928 to negotiate a modest budget increase from $2,250 per short to $2,500. What happened in that New York office changed the entire trajectory of the Disney empire. Mintz rejected the increase. Then he cut the budget below what Walt was already receiving. Then he disclosed the rest. He had spent months quietly signing away most of Walt's animators to individual contracts with his own production company. They would continue making Oswald cartoons without Walt. The character legally belonged to Universal through Mintz, and there was nothing Walt could do about it. Mintz offered him a salaried position working as an employee in his own studio's replacement. Walt turned it down. The animators who had defected included Hugh Harmon, Rudolph Ising, and Fritz Freleng, men who had followed Walt from Kansas City to Los Angeles and built the Oswald series alongside him. The ones who refused to sign with Mintz, who stayed loyal, were Works and a small handful of others, including Les Clark and Wilfred Jackson. Their loyalty, it turned out, was the most valuable thing in the room. On the train back to California, Walt and Lillian began sketching. Works designed the physical form of a new character, a mouse with round ears and a simplified silhouette that could be drawn quickly and consistently across thousands of frames. Walt named the character, defined his personality as cheerful and optimistic and slightly mischievous, and provided his voice. The character was Mickey Mouse. He debuted in Steamboat Willie on November 18, 1928, in the first cartoon to use synchronized sound as a fully integrated creative element rather than an afterthought. The film was a sensation. Works' contribution to the design and animation of Mickey Mouse was not publicly credited during Walt's lifetime. In the early 1930s, Works left the studio to attempt his own cartoon series. It failed. He returned to Disney in a technical role, working on special effects and camera systems, producing important innovations that the company benefited from for decades. He was never named publicly as the co-creator of Mickey Mouse while Walt was alive. The official credit went to Walt Disney alone. The lesson Walt had taken from the Mintz meeting was structural and permanent. He would never again work on a character he did not own. Every contract from that day forward, every deal, every relationship with every distributor and partner and network was built around the principle of retaining ownership of the asset. The empire that followed was not built on innocence or optimism. It was built on the cold, specific memory of a meeting in a New York office in February of 1928, where a distributor showed Walt exactly what happened to people who let someone else hold the title. Walt had his character, his studio, and a lesson he intended never to forget. Now he needed to convince the rest of Hollywood that a feature-length animated film was not, as one prominent studio executive put it at the time, Disney's folly. Nobody in Hollywood believed it would work. A feature-length animated film had never been made. The production would be expensive, the technology was unproven, and there was a widely held assumption that audiences simply would not sit still for an animated story long enough to justify the investment. Walt borrowed heavily against the studio. He borrowed against his own life insurance policy. He sold his personal car and used the money to keep the production going through a period when every rational analysis of the budget said they were already past the point of no return. His brother Roy, who had seen the numbers from the beginning and knew exactly how bad they were, later said that he had genuinely not known through most of the Snow White production whether they would finish it or go bankrupt in the attempt. Walt pushed his team past physical limits for years. The studio ran through the night on a schedule that was not a schedule so much as a sustained emergency. Animators worked until they could not hold a pencil, went home, slept for a few hours, and came back. New techniques were invented under pressure, tried once and kept or abandoned within days. The multiplane camera, which Walt had commissioned to give animated scenes genuine visual depth, was built in-house because nothing like it existed anywhere in the industry. Walt walked the floors at night and left notes on drawings left at desks. Some of those notes were encouraging, some were not. He told almost nobody outside the studio how bad the numbers looked, because he had concluded that information was more dangerous than the actual situation. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was released in December of 1937. The premiere was at the Carthay Circle Theater in Los Angeles, and Walt stood in the lobby watching the audience come in. He could not sit still through the screening. He stood in the back. He watched people's faces. He watched what happened in the room when the Seven Dwarfs marched home singing after a day in the mine, and when the evil queen asked the mirror her question, and when the ending arrived. When the lights came up, there was a sustained standing ovation. The film ran for over a year at Radio City Music Hall in New York City. Russian filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein called it the greatest motion picture ever made. It became the highest-grossing film of its era, earning a sum that dwarfed anything the studio had previously produced. Walt received a special Academy Award for it, presented as one full-size Oscar and 7 miniature ones, one for each dwarf. The studio was saved. The folly had become the foundation of everything that came after. The money did not reach the people who had made it. Walt had promised his animators a share of Snow White's profits, a bonus that was to represent their investment of years of creative labor at wages that, for many of them, had barely covered their living expenses through the production. The profits arrived. The bonus did not. Walt told his staff that the new studio building in Burbank, a beautiful and modern facility purpose-designed for the kind of large-scale production Snow White had required, was the bonus. They had built the building with their work, and now the building existed. That was the reward. The animators received the explanation and continued working. Flush with the film's earnings, Walt and Roy decided to do something they had wanted to do for years. Their parents, Elias and Flora, had been running a boarding house in Portland, Oregon, in reduced circumstances that both brothers found increasingly difficult to accept. The image of their parents scraping by while their sons' names appeared in newspapers around the world had become something Walt could not look at directly. With the Snow White money available, the brothers bought their parents a house in North Hollywood as a gift to mark Elias and Flora's 50th wedding anniversary. The house at 2156 North Woking Way was comfortable, newly built, and staffed with a housekeeper named Alma Smith. It was meant to say, "We made it, and we are bringing you with us." Flora moved in and almost immediately noticed a smell from the furnace. It was persistent enough that she mentioned it to the housekeeper and to Walt. Walt sent repairmen from the studio to assess and fix the problem. They examined the furnace, checked what they checked, and reported back that it was fine. On the morning of November 26, 1938, Elias woke and found his wife unconscious on the floor of the bathroom. He tried to carry her to another room and collapsed himself before he reached the door. When Alma Smith arrived at the house that morning, she began to feel dizzy and faint before she had been inside long enough to understand what was happening. She recognized something was wrong, made it outside, called a neighbor, and together the two of them dragged both Elias and Flora out of the house and on to the front lawn. Elias survived. Flora did not. She was 70 years old. They had lived in the house for less than a month. The cause was carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty connection in the gas furnace. The furnace the studio repairman had reported as fine. Walt attended the funeral. The same day, he drove back to the studio and returned to work. He did not speak about his mother's death publicly. He did not speak about it privately, as far as anyone who knew him could later confirm. He absorbed it the way he absorbed most of the harder things in his life, silently, completely, and in a way that left traces everywhere without ever acknowledging their source. Documentary producer Don Hahn, who spent decades working for the Disney Company and made films about its history, described it this way. Walt personally felt responsible because he had become so successful that he said, "Let me buy you a house." He never spoke about that time. Nobody ever does. Walt had 2 nervous breakdowns during his lifetime. The films his studio produced in the years following his mother's death, Bambi, Dumbo, Cinderella, and others, featured dead or absent mothers as structural elements of the story. In Bambi, the mother is shot off screen, and the story is essentially about surviving that loss. In Dumbo, the mother is imprisoned for trying to protect her child. In Cinderella, the mother is gone before the story begins, replaced by a woman who treats the child as a servant. The pattern runs through film after film across the entire decade, following November of 1938. Whether this was deliberate, unconscious, or simply the result of adapting fairy tales that were themselves full of dead mothers is a question that genuinely cannot be answered from the available evidence. Walt never raised it. The people around him did not raise it to his face. What can be said is that the people who knew him in his later years consistently described a man who was carrying something heavy and had been carrying it for a long time. He drove back to the studio. He had a lot of work to do. By 1940, the Walt Disney Studio had grown from a handful of people in a borrowed garage into a 1,200-person industrial operation in a purpose-built facility in Burbank. And something essential in the atmosphere of the place had changed. The warmth of the early years, the sense that everyone was building something together in close quarters, with a shared stake in the outcome, had been replaced by something more formal and more distant. Walt had become, to most of the people who worked for him, not Walt, but Mr. Disney. He walked through the studio late at night and on weekends when most of the staff had gone home, leaving notes, moving work from one pile to another, redirecting projects without explanation. During working hours, he was rarely on the floor. Meetings happened in his office, and invitations to those meetings were not evenly distributed. The physical design of the new Burbank studio, which Walt had overseen himself with architect Kem Weber, told the story of how the organization had changed. The building was beautiful and functional and deliberately hierarchical. Different departments occupied different buildings. Access between departments was controlled. The ink and paint department, staffed almost entirely by women, operated in a separate structure from the male-dominated animation department. There were separate dining facilities for different levels of staff. Walt had a private screening room, a private dining room, and a private office suite that included a sitting area and a separate entrance. The studio that had begun with everyone crowded into one room making something together had become, in its new home, something closer to a factory, organized around a single, irreplaceable creative authority at the center. The studio hierarchy was rigid and difficult to understand from the outside. Some senior animators earned $300 a week. Entry-level employees earned as little as $12. People sitting next to each other doing comparable work could be separated by $20 a week in pay with no transparent logic to the difference. Staff were required to sign documents stating they worked a standard 40-hour week. Their actual hours were considerably longer. And the bonus from Snow White, promised explicitly during the production and anticipated through 2 subsequent films, had never arrived. Both Pinocchio and Fantasia, released in 1940, failed at the box office. The reasons were structural and external. The European market had been effectively eliminated by the outbreak of the Second World War, and Europe had represented roughly half the studio's total revenue. Disney was deeply in debt and could not meet its obligations in the ordinary course of business. Walt did not tell his employees. He told them instead, in a speech to the full studio gathered in the auditorium, that the people who contributed most to the organization deserved certain privileges that others did not, and that he expected them to put their own house in order rather than look to him for solutions. The speech did not go over well. Art Babbitt had been with the studio since the early 1930s, brought in from New York where he had been working at the Van Buren Corporation. He was one of the highest-paid animators in the building, earning $300 a week, and was the animator primarily responsible for creating Goofy as a distinct character with a coherent physical and emotional identity. His technique was precise, and his commitment to the craft was widely respected across the industry. He had also been watching the pay structure, the bonus situation, and the studio's response to the box office failure of Pinocchio and Fantasia, and he had reached a conclusion. In the spring of 1941, Babbitt joined the Screen Cartoonists Guild and began organizing his colleagues. Walt took this as a personal act of betrayal, not a labor dispute, not a difference of opinion about wages. Betrayal. He and Babbitt had worked closely together for years. Walt had given him the Goofy assignment specifically because he trusted his ability. He had paid him $300 a week at a time when most animators earned far less. The fact that Babbitt had chosen to use that position not as evidence of trust, but as a platform to organize the people around him, was something Walt could not process as anything other than a stab in the back. On May 27, 1941, Walt fired Babbitt and 13 other cartoonists for their union activity. The following morning, more than 200 employees walked out. The picket line outside the Burbank studio was unlike anything Hollywood's labor history had seen before. The people walking it were professional artists. Their signs were not generic labor placards. They were painted with studio-quality craft and a caustic wit that the press found completely irresistible. Placards depicted Pluto saying he had a bone to pick, Jiminy Cricket declaring it was not cricket to cross a picket line, and signs reading "One genius against 600 guinea pigs." The average age of the strikers was under 25. One striker set up an easel on a hill across the street from the studio entrance and painted a landscape of the scene as it unfolded below him. Another walked the line wearing a beret. When Disney arranged for the film Dumbo to have its premiere during the strike, the picketers showed up at the theater. When Walt left the studio each day, he drove through the line of people his work had made possible. Looking straight ahead, Walt's response was to purchase advertising space in Variety magazine and publish a statement attributing the strike entirely to communist agitation, leadership, and activities. He characterized the organizers as a small group of outside agitators who did not represent the genuine sentiment of his employees. President Roosevelt, who was monitoring West Coast labor unrest carefully as the country moved toward war footing, sent a federal mediator named James Dewey to Los Angeles. Dewey reviewed the evidence and found in the union's favor on every substantive point. The strike lasted 5 weeks. The studio signed the union contracts. Babbitt was formally reinstated by government order, though his relationship with Walt never recovered. The hard feelings on both sides lasted for the rest of people's careers. On July 13th, while the strike was still running, Walt was driving past the picket line when Art Babbitt, standing on the line, called out to him directly. Walt stopped his car. He got out. Babbitt moved toward him. Walt moved toward Babbitt. The space between them was closing when studio security guards physically intercepted both men and separated them before the confrontation could complete itself. Walt later said the strike was the worst experience of his entire professional life. He said this more than once in more than one context, and the people who heard him say it believed he meant it. What he did not say publicly, what the public did not learn for decades, was that the strike had intersected with something Walt had been doing since 1936. The relationship between Walt Disney and the Federal Bureau of Investigation had begun in 1936 with a friendly letter from J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover was by that point already constructing a network of informants inside the American entertainment industry, and Walt Disney, at 34, was one of the most visible and publicly trusted figures in Hollywood. Hoover understood the value of that kind of visibility. Walt, for his part, understood the value of Hoover's protection. By 1940, Walt was an active informant. He reported Hollywood colleagues as suspected communists. He provided regular information about the entertainment industry's internal politics to the FBI's Los Angeles field office. He allowed Hoover input on certain Disney productions, including the 1943 package film Saludos Amigos, which the FBI actively encouraged as part of a broader effort to build goodwill in Latin America during wartime. Disney production units received access to FBI facilities, resources, and cooperation on projects that benefited from government endorsement. In return, Walt received something more valuable than any of those things. He was protected from the very anti-communist machinery he was helping to operate. During the strike of 1941, Walt had used his existing FBI relationships to frame the labor dispute as a communist operation rather than a wages dispute. When he testified before the House Committee on Un-American Activities in October of 1947, he was prepared. He named Herbert Sorrell, the head of the Conference of Studio Unions, as a communist. He named the strike itself as a communist-instigated action. He named several of the animators who had organized or supported the strike as communist sympathizers and subversives. He did not present evidence in any formal legal sense. He presented characterizations. The committee accepted them without requiring documentation, because that was how those hearings worked. Accusation was the mechanism. Evidence was optional. Some of the people Walt named, or whose names appeared in proximity to his testimony, were placed on the Hollywood blacklist. They lost work. Some faced formal investigation by other government agencies. Several left the industry entirely. The social stigma attached to the accusation was sufficient in the political climate of 1947 to end careers without a trial, without a conviction, without any formal finding of wrongdoing. The cost of being named was the point. That was the function the process was designed to perform. In 1954, Hoover elevated Walt's operational status within the FBI's informant network to Special Agent in Charge Contact. This designation meant that Walt was not simply providing information when asked. He was trusted to receive information from other informants and relay it directly to the FBI's senior field agents in Los Angeles, operating as a node in the network rather than a peripheral source. He was, by this stage, something closer to an active participant in the FBI's Hollywood intelligence operation than to a citizen occasionally cooperating with federal authorities. His total FBI file eventually ran to 570 pages. The vast majority of those pages remain classified or heavily redacted. Researchers who have accessed what is available describe a file that spans from 1936 to 1966, 30 years, and documents a relationship that was operational throughout. What Walt specifically provided across those 3 decades cannot be confirmed from the material that is publicly available. The redactions are extensive enough that the full scope of his contribution to the FBI's surveillance of the entertainment industry may never be known with any precision. Walt was not operating in isolation. Ronald Reagan was an FBI informant during the same period, reporting on Screen Actors Guild members he suspected of communist sympathies. Adolph Menjou, Gary Cooper, and Robert Taylor all testified voluntarily before HUAC. The political climate of the late 1940s and 1950s was genuinely volatile, and fear of Soviet infiltration of American institutions was not manufactured purely from cynicism. There were real Soviet intelligence operations targeting American cultural and political life. These facts do not change what happened to the people who were named. They simply place those outcomes in a context where the behavior that produced them was considerably less unusual than it appears from the present day. Walt was not a solitary actor running an unprecedented operation. He was one of many doing a common thing. What makes his case different in its weight and its meaning is the specific nature of the people he helped expose. He did not primarily name foreign agents or Soviet operatives. He named his own employees. He named people who had worked for him for years, who had used their skills to help build something with his name on it, who had asked for fair wages and credit for their work, and who he then described to a congressional committee as enemies of American society. The newspaper route in Kansas City had taught Walt a clear lesson about what happens when someone holds power over you and decides not to protect you. He had spent his career making sure he was never in that position again. He had simply not noticed, or chosen not to notice, that he had placed himself on the other side of the transaction. On television, every Sunday night through the 1950s and into the 60s, Walt Disney stood in front of a camera on the set of his show and introduced stories about animals and children and the importance of believing in impossible things. He talked about creativity and optimism and the power of imagination to make the world into something better than it was. He was speaking to millions of American families who trusted him completely, and he meant every word of it. He also reported people to the government for 30 years. Both of these things were the same man. None of the FBI cooperation was publicly known while he was alive. The version of Walt that appeared on Sunday nights was also real. He was not performing a character entirely disconnected from who he was. The warmth was genuine. The belief in stories was genuine. The commitment to the work was genuine. The damage to the people he named was also genuine. All of it occupied the same person simultaneously, which is perhaps the most uncomfortable aspect of the whole story, because it refuses the simpler explanation. He was not a hypocrite concealing a secret self. He was a complicated person doing things that could not be reconciled with each other, and he reconciled them anyway, the way people do. Walt Disney died on December 15, 1966. He was 65 years old, lung cancer from the cigarettes he had brought back from France after the First World War. He died at 9:35 in the morning in St. Joseph's Hospital in Burbank, directly across the street from his studio. In the weeks before his death, when he could no longer work in any conventional sense, he had been lying in his hospital bed staring at the ceiling. The ceiling was divided into a grid of tiles, each one 24 inches by 24 inches. He had been using those tiles as a map. Each square represented 1 square mile. He was placing roads and transit corridors and residential neighborhoods and industrial zones and the pedestrian pathways that would connect them. He was designing the experimental prototype community of tomorrow, a city of 20,000 permanent residents that would be built on land the company had secretly acquired in Central Florida, governed by its own independent municipal structure under the Reedy Creek Improvement District, and designed to demonstrate what American urban life could look like if it were planned from the beginning around the technologies that existed rather than the technologies of a century earlier. He had presented the vision on film for the Florida legislature and the investment community. He had secured the land. He had secured the governmental structure. He had the map on the ceiling. He died before the ground was broken. The EPCOT city was abandoned almost immediately after his death. The board of directors determined that without Walt to drive it, the project was too speculative, too complex, and too dependent on the creative authority of a single person who was no longer there. The Florida land and the Reedy Creek structure were retained. The city was not built. In 1982, EPCOT Center opened at Walt Disney World in Florida. It was organized as a permanent World's Fair, with pavilions dedicated to technology and national pavilions representing a selection of countries arranged around a central lagoon. It was successful as a theme park. It had gift shops and restaurants and rides and seasonal festivals. It bore no meaningful resemblance to a functioning city of 20,000 permanent residents. The most ambitious project of Walt Disney's life, the one he had spent his final weeks building in his imagination from a hospital ceiling, became a place where tourists could ride a simulated journey through the human body and eat bratwurst beside a replica of a German clock tower. Back in California, Lillian had gone home to the house on Carolwood Drive. The barn was still in the backyard. The tunnel was still under the rose garden. The stone archway still said 1950. By 1949, with the studio recovered from the strike years and the war years and the debt, Walt had found somewhere to put the part of himself that did not belong to any of it. In June of that year, he and Lillian purchased 5 acres of land in the Holmby Hills neighborhood of Los Angeles. The address was 355 North Carolwood Drive, and the name of the street gave Walt's next project its name. The property had been chosen for a specific reason. Walt needed land, flat and extensive enough to build a railroad. His love of trains was one of the oldest things about him. It ran back to the Santa Fe line, near Marceline and his uncle Mike Martin at the throttle, and the hours he had spent as a child pressing his ear to the track to feel an approaching train before he could hear it. It ran through the summers he had spent as a teenager selling newspapers and candy on freight routes out of Kansas City. It ran through every steam engine he had ever watched from a platform or a hill. In 1948, Walt had attended the Chicago Railroad Fair, and by all accounts he had come back from it barely able to contain himself. He wanted a locomotive. He wanted track. He wanted the whole operation to run around his house. Walt spent months that fall reading everything he could find about miniature railroading. He hired Roger Brogy, the head of the studio's machine shop, to help him design and build the equipment. Brogy was a mechanical engineer who had worked for Walt for years and understood both the technical requirements and Walt's inability to accept a second-best result. Together, they designed a live steam locomotive at 1/8 scale. The engine would burn oil, produce actual steam, and operate with the same mechanical principles as a full-size railroad. There would be no shortcuts. Walt was not interested in a toy. The Carolwood Pacific Railroad was built in 1950. It was 1/8 scale, live steam, with 1/2 mile of track that circled the entire 5-acre property. The studio prop shop fabricated the rolling stock, a boxcar, 2 stock cars, a flat car, and a caboose, all built to the same scale as the locomotive. The engine was named Lily Bell, after Lillian. Walt named most things he loved after her. When Walt's track planning required the railroad to pass through Lillian's rose garden, Lillian refused to allow it. Walt did not argue. He had his studio engineers design and construct a 90-foot curved tunnel that passed beneath the garden, allowing the train to continue on its route without disturbing a single rose. The tunnel entrance was marked by a stone archway. The archway was dated 1950. It is still there. One estimate places the total cost of the Carolwood Pacific at $50,000, covering the track laying, the relocation of power lines that stood in the way of the route, and the fabrication of the rolling stock. Walt paid it. He had spent decades carefully managing money he did not have. He spent $50,000 on a backyard train without apparent hesitation. On the property, Walt also built a small red barn. He modeled it on the barn from the Marceline farm, the one his family had kept on the 48 acres where he had spent the 4 happiest years of his childhood. He called the barn his happy place. He spent hours alone in it, building model trains and working through mechanical problems, and by his own account, simply being somewhere that required nothing of him. The studio required everything of him. The railroad required skill and attention and care. The barn required nothing. He could close the door and be the boy from Marceline for as long as he needed to be. The landscaping for the Carolwood estate was done by a man named Jack Evans and his younger brother Bill. Walt was so satisfied with the quality of their work that when Disneyland was in development, he hired both of them to help design the grounds of the park. Bill Evans continued working for the Disney Company for decades. He was eventually honored as a Disney legend with commemorative windows bearing his name on Main Street, USA, at both Disneyland in California and the Magic Kingdom at Walt Disney World in Florida. Every carefully maintained garden at every Disney park in the world has some lineage, however indirect, to a conversation that began between Walt and 2 landscapers on 5 acres in Holmby Hills. The Carolwood Pacific ran from December of 1950 to May of 1953, when a young girl visiting the property was burned by steam from the locomotive, and Walt suspended the railroad's operation, rather than risk another injury. That same year, he began shifting his primary creative attention to the project the railroad had been quietly preparing him for. He had been thinking for years about a place where parents and children could experience his stories together, inside them, rather than watching them from seats in a dark theater. The specific problems he had solved building the Carolwood Pacific, routing a railroad through a complex environment, managing the relationship between moving vehicles and fixed landscape features, thinking about how people move through a designed space, had been filling in the practical architecture of what that place might look like. He shut the railroad down in 1953. He had a bigger track to lay. Almost nothing Walt Disney ever built was built alone, and the person most responsible for enabling it all is someone most people who love what he built have never thought about carefully for more than a moment. Roy Oliver Disney was born in 1893, 8 years before Walt. He was the financial architect of everything the studio became. Roy had a high school diploma and some years of bank work behind him when he got out of a tuberculosis ward to help start the studio in 1923. And with those tools, he helped construct one of the most durable entertainment enterprises in American history. He read the contracts. He managed the banking relationships. He made sure, in Walt's own words, that the checks did not bounce. Roy described their dynamic himself in the direct and slightly self-deprecating language that was his natural register. Walt, he noted, had always been peeing on him, even as a little kid sharing a bed, and his assessment was that Walt had been doing it in one way or another ever since. It was not a complaint. It was an accurate description of the structural relationship between them, and Roy delivered it without apparent bitterness. His actual contributions to the studio are worth enumerating because they are rarely enumerated anywhere. Roy proposed the name change from Disney Brothers Cartoon Studio to Walt Disney Studio, placing his brother's name on the door and removing his own. He was the company's first chief executive officer, a title not officially formalized until 1966 but functionally held from the beginning. He managed the Bank of America loan relationships that kept the studio solvent through the Great Depression, at a time when no bank in America had a particular reason to keep an animation studio alive. He negotiated the deal with ABC that funded the construction of Disneyland, the first of its kind in the entertainment industry, a television contract used to finance a physical park. He structured the buyout of ABC's 34% stake in Disneyland after the park proved successful, paying $7.5 million, 15 times ABC's original investment, to give the studio complete ownership of the property. Walt had asked him beforehand whether the buyout was truly necessary. Roy said it was. It was. Roy was genuinely opposed to Disneyland when Walt first proposed it. He thought the finances were speculative and the concept unproven. Walt made clear, in the way Walt made things clear when he had decided, that he was going to build the park regardless of whether the studio participated, using his own money if necessary. Roy eventually came around, structured the financing, and managed the relationships that made construction possible. When the park opened in July of 1955 and immediately became something no one had expected, Roy acted quickly to secure the studio's complete ownership of the asset. His instinct on the buyout was right. Walt appeared on television every Sunday night. Walt was in the promotional photographs. Walt received the Academy Awards, 22 of them across his career, a record that remains unbroken. Roy sat across from bankers and lawyers and network executives and made sure the numbers worked. The public story of the Disney empire is Walt's story. The operational story is Roy's, running in parallel with it, quieter, more accountable, equally essential. Walt acknowledged this once publicly at a dinner gala in Los Angeles. He said that if it had not been for his big brother, he was fairly sure he would have ended up in jail several times for writing checks that could not clear, and that he had genuinely never known what was in the bank. Roy had kept him honest. It was Walt being funny and Walt being truthful in the same breath. And it was also Walt doing something he did consistently, offering Roy full acknowledgement in a single sentence and then moving on. By the early 1960s, both brothers had fixed their attention on Central Florida. Market surveys had revealed that only 2% of Disneyland's visitors were traveling from east of the Mississippi River, despite the fact that 75% of the American population lived there. A new park in the eastern half of the country could reach an entirely different audience. But Walt had a second reason that was just as important as the first. Disneyland in California had been surrounded almost immediately after opening by cheap motels, souvenir shops, and roadside businesses that Walt found aesthetically devastating. He had no control over what existed outside his own property line. For the Florida project, he intended to control everything. Disney used a network of dummy corporations bearing names including the I-4 Corporation, the Latin American Development and Management Corporation, and the Reedy Creek Ranch Corporation to secretly purchase 27,443 acres of mostly swamp and cattle pasture southwest of Orlando. The land cost roughly $200 per acre. Sellers were mostly happy to be rid of it. The secret held until October of 1965, when the Orlando Sentinel identified the buyer and broke the story. By then, the bulk of the acquisition was complete. Disney then lobbied the Florida legislature for a governmental arrangement that had no real precedent in American law. The Reedy Creek Improvement District, approved in 1967, gave the Disney Company the powers of a county government over the property, including the authority to build and maintain its own roads, utilities, and emergency services, and explicit immunity from current or future county or state land use regulations. It was a private government, and the Florida legislature approved it largely because Walt's film presenting the EPCOT vision had convinced the state that the economic benefits would be substantial. Walt died in December of 1966 without seeing a single shovel break ground. Roy was 73 years old and had been actively preparing to retire. He postponed retirement, took personal control of the Florida project, refused to allow it to be scaled back or abandoned, and drove the construction through completion without his brother. Walt Disney World opened on October 1, 1971. The total cost was $400 million. The project carried no additional debt at opening. Roy gave the dedication speech. He named it Walt Disney World, not simply Disney World. He was specific about the reason. He wanted the world to know it was Walt's dream, and he wanted Walt's name on it. Roy died 63 days after the park opened, December 20th, 1971. He was 78 years old. He had come out of a tuberculosis ward nearly 50 years earlier to help his brother start a studio in a borrowed garage. The last thing he did was finish the largest project his brother had begun. He was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Hollywood Hills, next to his wife Edna. Without Walt, the Walt Disney Company did not know what Walt Disney would have done, and this turned out to be a problem that took the better part of 2 decades to resolve. The period following Walt's death in 1966 and Roy's in 1971 is referred to by historians of the studio as the Dark Age, and the label is accurate in a specific way. The company did not collapse. It was not in imminent danger of bankruptcy. The parks continued to operate and continued to make money, but the films the studio produced through the 1970s and into the early 1980s were, with rare exceptions, exactly what you would expect from an organization that had lost the person who gave it its artistic authority and was now trying to remember how to be itself without him. The Rescuers in 1977 and The Fox and the Hound in 1981 were competent, technically proficient films that did decent business and then disappeared from cultural memory almost immediately. The Black Cauldron in 1985 nearly brought the animation division down entirely, running massively over budget, performing disastrously at the box office, and demonstrating with painful clarity that the studio no longer had any coherent sense of what a Disney animated film was supposed to feel like. The problem was structural. Walt had not been the president of the company. He had not been the chief executive in any formal sense for most of his career. He had been the creative authority, the person whose taste and conviction gave every decision at the studio its aesthetic shape. And there was no institutional process for replacing that. The new leadership that followed Roy O. ran the company by committee, and creative decisions made by committee at an organization that had never operated that way before produced the predictable results. By the early 1980s, the situation had attracted a different kind of attention. Corporate raiders, the financial operators who bought undervalued companies and liquidated them for parts, had identified Disney as a target. The calculation was not complicated. The company's stock price was depressed relative to the actual value of its assets. The film library, which included decades of animated and live-action titles, was worth substantially more than the market was crediting. The theme parks were worth more. The real estate holdings accumulated over decades at prices that had long since been surpassed by the market were worth substantially more. Break the company into its components, sell the components separately, and the total would be far larger than what the stock currently reflected. Saul Steinberg of Reliance Group Holdings initiated the first serious takeover attempt in 1984. Disney's management responded with a greenmail payment, buying back Steinberg's stake at a premium above market price to make him go away, which infuriated shareholders and left the company looking both vulnerable and poorly managed. Corporate raider Irwin Jacobs followed with his own accumulation of Disney shares. The situation was genuinely dangerous. Roy Edward Disney, Walt's nephew and the son of Roy O.S., was serving on the board of directors. He had resigned as a production executive from the company in 1977, telling anyone who asked that the studio was no longer creatively interesting, and that he could not watch what was happening to it from the inside without doing something about it, and that he was not in a position to do anything about it from where he sat. He kept his board seat. When the hostile takeover threats materialized, he returned to active involvement, worked with his financial advisor Stanley Gold to organize a defensive response, and ultimately helped bring in a new management team, Michael Eisner as chief executive officer and Frank Wells as president. Eisner and Wells arrived in September of 1984. Roy E. retained an active role overseeing the animation division. The arrangement worked because the people in it were suited to their functions. Eisner was aggressive, commercially ambitious, and genuinely interested in the entertainment business. Wells was disciplined and administratively gifted. Roy E. knew what a Disney film was supposed to feel like in a way that nobody else in the building did, because he had grown up in the building. Together they produced something the studio had not produced since Walt was alive. The films that came out of the renewed animation division became what the industry calls the Disney Renaissance. The Little Mermaid in 1989, Beauty and the Beast in 1991, Aladdin in 1992, The Lion King in 1994. These were not merely commercially successful films. They were films that people remembered, that they brought their children to see and then brought their children's children to see, films that established characters and songs and moments that entered the wider culture and stayed there. The Lion King earned nearly $1 billion in its original release, making it the highest-grossing traditionally animated film ever made at that point in the history of the art form. The family that had built all of it was watching from an increasing distance. The public stock offering in 1957 had begun the dilution of family ownership, and that process had continued without interruption for nearly 4 decades. Roy E. Disney held approximately 16 million shares of the company at the time of his death on December 16, 2009. That represented roughly 1% of the total outstanding shares. 1% of the company whose name came from his uncle, whose financial architecture had been built by his father, and whose animation legacy he had personally saved from liquidation in 1984. Walt's younger daughter Sharon had died in 1993. A dispute broke out among her 3 children in the years following her death over the terms of her trust, involving accusations of mental incompetence, allegations of conspiracy among the trustees, and statements made under oath in court that no family would choose to make in public. The 2-week trial in December of 2013 aired the details openly. It was the most visible evidence that the private family underneath the celebrated brand carried the same weight that private families always carry, regardless of what the name says on the entrance gate. Meanwhile, at the house on Carolwood Drive, Lillian Disney had been living alone for 30 years. The barn was in the backyard. The tunnel ran under the rose garden. The stone archway dated 1950 was where it had always been, unchanged. Lillian Disney died in December of 1997, 31 years after her husband. The family sold the Carolwood Drive property the following year to a developer named Gabriel Brenner, a co-owner of the Houston Dynamo Soccer Club. He paid $8,450,000 for it. This was the land where the Carolwood Pacific had run its half-mile loop, where the barn stood, where the tunnel went under Lillian's garden and came out the other side, where Walt had spent what he called the happiest period of his adult life. $8,450,000. Brenner demolished the original house, not renovated, not preserved as a historic structure. Demolished. The building Walt and Lillian had moved into in the winter of 1950, the one Walt called the happiest home on earth, was removed from the site. In its place, completed in 2001, a new 35,000-square-foot mansion was constructed on the same 5 acres. It had 8 bedrooms and 17 bathrooms, a swimming pool, a wine cellar, a tennis court, a library, a private gymnasium, a putting green, and a dedicated movie room. The original gate at the entrance to the property was kept. Part of Lillian's rose garden was kept. The 90-foot tunnel beneath the garden was kept, its stone archway entrance still visible, still bearing the date, 1950, the only thing on the property that connected the mansion, sitting there now to the man who had built the railroad and the barn and called it home. Before the demolition, Walt's daughter Diane had made a specific request. The barn should be saved. Diane and Disney historian Michael Broggie arranged with the city of Los Angeles and the Los Angeles Live Steamers Railroad Museum in Griffith Park to have the structure dismantled and relocated. Workers took the barn apart piece by piece, labeling each element, and rebuilt it on the museum grounds using roughly 80% of the original material. Architect Miguel Fernandez updated the construction drawings by John Cowles, who had designed the barn for Walt in the first place, making the minimal adjustments necessary to satisfy modern fire and building codes. On July 18, 1999, the rebuilt barn was dedicated by Diane and members of the extended Disney family. It is now called Walt Disney's Carolwood Barn. It stands on the northern side of Griffith Park in Los Angeles. It is open on the 3rd Sunday of every month. There is no admission charge. It is operated entirely by volunteers from the Carolwood Foundation, on behalf of the Walt Disney Family Foundation. It is sometimes referred to informally as the only free Disney attraction in the world. After the new mansion was completed, the Carolwood estate sat as a private residence for over a decade. In 2013, it was listed for sale at $90 million. It did not sell at that price. In June of 2014, it was sold to an unidentified international buyer for $74 million. $16 million below the asking price. The same land that had sold for $8,450,000 in 1998 sold 16 years later with a replacement structure on it for $74 million. The stone archway in the garden connected the two transactions. Nothing else did. There's a version of the Walt Disney story that is both entirely true and entirely incomplete. A boy from a hard childhood in Missouri believed in the power of imagination and built something that had never existed before, and the world he built is still running. Every film, every park, every character on every bag and wrapper in more than 100 countries, it came from somewhere real. It came from the Dreaming Tree and Marceline and the Santa Fe trains and the drawings sold to a neighbor doctor for small change and the years of cold mornings delivering papers in Kansas City for nothing at all. That version is not wrong. It is simply missing its reckoning. The animators who walked the picket line in 1941 were not wrong either. They had helped build something extraordinary and had been paid as little as $12 a week for doing it. And when they asked for fair compensation and credit for their work, they were characterized as threats to the country before a congressional committee by the man who had asked them to help him build it. Some of them never worked in the industry again. Ubi Works designed the mouse. Roy Disney built the finances and then removed his own name from the studio sign. Flora Disney died in a house her son bought with a furnace his repairman had failed to fix. Roy finished the resort and died 63 days after opening day. Roy E. spent his adult life fighting for a company his family's labor had built, ending with roughly 1% of its ownership. Walt mapped a city onto hospital ceiling tiles in the weeks before his death, and the city was never built, and the ceiling tiles were just tiles. The barn in Griffith Park is the most honest monument to all of it. It is small and red and looks like the barn on a farm in Marceline, Missouri, where a 4-year-old boy arrived in 1906 and decided, without quite knowing what he was deciding, that the world needed to be more beautiful than it was. Inside the barn are model trains and railroad artifacts, and photographs of a man who looks, in nearly every image taken there, genuinely at ease in a way he rarely looked anywhere else. There is no charge to walk through the door. Nobody rushes over when you come in. You can stand in the space where Walt Disney worked alone on his trains and think about what it cost and what it produced and whether those two things can ever be fully separated from each other. The Walt Disney Company is currently worth several $100 billion. The family that built it holds roughly 1%. The house where Disneyland was invented is gone. The barn where the man who invented it was happiest is open on the third Sunday of every month, free of charge, in a park on the north side of Los Angeles. If you found this story worth your time, please consider subscribing. We tell these kinds of stories every week.